Have you ever noticed how the biggest changes in life don't always come with shouting or fighting, but with calm voices, polite smiles, and people telling you, "Don't worry, this is for your own good"? That's how it started for me, not with anger, not with tears, but with a soft conversation at my own kitchen table, the kind where everyone nods a little too much and speaks a little too gently, sigh as if they're afraid you might break. My son sat across from me that morning, hands folded, eyes lowered, speaking slowly like I was already fragile, already half gone, and he said he was worried about me, worried I might fall, worried I might forget to turn off the stove, worried I was alone too much, and I remember thinking, when did I become someone people worry about instead of someone they listen to? He kept saying words like temporary and just until things are better and we'll take care of everything, and those words sounded kind, almost loving, but something in my chest felt tight, like a warning I couldn't explain. I laughed a little ha-ha-ha, trying to lighten the mood, saying I'd lived in that house longer than he'd been alive, that the walls knew my footsteps, that I was fine, really, but he didn't laugh back. He just nodded again and said, "I know, Mom. But trust me." And that was the moment, the very first moment, when my life began to move without my permission, because once someone asks you to trust them instead of asking what you want, the decision is already being made. The bags were packed quickly, too quickly for something that was supposed to be temporary, and every object I picked up felt heavier than it should have, like it knew it wasn't coming back soon. I remember standing in my bedroom, running my hand over the dresser, touching the photo frames, sigh, feeling silly for getting emotional over furniture. But when you've lived somewhere for decades, it's not just wood and walls, it's proof that you existed there. My son kept checking his phone, telling me the place was nice, that I'd like it, that there were nurses and meals and people my age, and he said all this with such confidence that for a second I wondered if I was the one being unreasonable. Have you ever doubted your own feelings just because someone sounded so sure? That's how they get you, quietly, gently, without force. The car ride was silent, the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting, and I stared out the window, watching familiar streets slide past, realizing I didn't know when I'd see them again, if ever. When we arrived, the building looked clean and calm, almost comforting, and the staff smiled at me like I was expected, which should have reassured me, but instead it made my stomach drop because expected means planned, and plan means this wasn't just an idea, it was already done. Papers were placed in front of me, lots of papers with small letters and long words, and my son pointed where to sign, saying, "Just standard stuff, Mom," and I signed because saying no felt rude, felt dramatic, felt like causing trouble, and isn't it strange how we're taught our whole lives not to be difficult, even when our entire future is being decided? I remember one nurse touching my arm kindly, saying, "You'll be comfortable here," and I smiled back because that's what you do, but inside I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in her own life. As the door closed behind my son that first day, I told myself not to cry, not to make a scene, not to prove anyone right by looking weak, so I sat on the bed and took a deep breath, telling myself it was just for a while, just until he felt better about things, just until everyone calmed down. But time moves differently in places like that, hours stretch, thoughts grow louder, and at night when everything is quiet, the questions creep in, questions no one asked you, like why didn't he ask me what I wanted, or why did this happen so fast, or why did it feel like goodbye even though no one said the word. Days passed, then weeks, and every time I asked about going home, the answer was always smooth and delayed. Soon, we'll see, let's talk about it later, and later never came. I tried calling my son more often at first, then less because I didn't want to sound needy, didn't want to remind him I was here, waiting, sigh, and isn't that the saddest part, when you start shrinking yourself so others don't feel burdened by your existence? One afternoon, sitting by the window, watching people come and go, I realized something that made my hands shake a little, that nobody had told me how long I was staying, because nobody expected me to leave. That thought hit harder than any argument could have, and for the first time, I wondered if this place wasn't meant to help me, but to move me out of the way. If this story already feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever felt gently pushed aside by the people you trusted most, maybe you understand why I'm telling it, and if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories that sound quiet on the surface but carry heavy truths underneath, you might want to stay with this channel, because you're not alone in feeling this way. I wish I could say I stood up right then and demanded answers, but I didn't. I stayed quiet, I stayed polite, I stayed patient, because that's what I'd always done, and patience had always been praised as strength, until I realized patience can also be used against you. It wasn't until much later, much too late, that I learned what was happening outside those walls, what decisions were being made while I sat there convincing myself to be grateful, and that's the part that still makes me shake my head ha-ha-ha. In disbelief, because while I was learning the schedule of mealtimes and medication rounds, my life back home was already being handled like it no longer belonged to me, and that's when I started to wonder. Not if I would ever go home, but what exactly was waiting for me if I did. Do you know what's strange about places meant to take care of you, how quickly they teach you a new version of time, one where days blur together and your old life starts to feel like something you dreamed. That was the second thing I noticed after the quiet wore off, not the routines or the food or the soft voices calling my name, but the way my memories began to feel distant, like they belonged to someone else. Sigh, and every morning I woke up thinking I'd go home that day, only to realize no one had said when. I tried to stay busy at first, smiling at people, joining activities I didn't really care about, telling myself this was just a pause, not an ending. But every pause gets uncomfortable when it lasts too long. I started asking small questions, gentle ones, the kind that don't sound like complaints, asking when my son would visit next, asking when I could spend a night back at my house just to check on things, and every answer came wrapped in kindness but tied with delay. He's busy. Let's see how you're feeling, maybe next week. And next week kept moving like a shadow. Have you ever felt yourself becoming careful with your own words, afraid that asking too much might make things worse? That's what I became, careful, quiet, agreeable, because I didn't want to be labeled difficult, didn't want to confirm whatever fears they already had about me. One afternoon, I finally asked to go home, just for a few hours, and the nurse smiled sadly and said it might confuse me, and I remember thinking, ha ha ha, confuse me. I had lived in that house for decades, but I nodded anyway because arguing felt exhausting. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the layout of my living room, the sound of my front door, the way the sunlight fell across the floor in the mornings, and the more I thought about it, the more scared I became that if I didn't hold on to those details, they might slip away from me. So the next day I called my son myself, my voice shaking just a little, and asked him when I could come back home, and there was a pause on the line, a pause that felt heavier than words before he said, "Let's not rush things, Mom," and something in that sentence felt final, like a door closing quietly. I laughed weakly, trying to soften the moment, saying I missed my houseplants, missed my chair by the window, and he chuckled too, but his laugh didn't reach me, and when the call ended, I stared at the phone, realizing I didn't know when I'd last been inside my own front door. Days passed, and slowly I noticed people stopped asking me about my home, stopped treating it like a place I was returning to, and started talking as if this was where I belonged now, using words like your room and your schedule, and every time I heard them, my chest tightened. Have you ever felt replaced in your own life, like your role quietly changed without a meeting or a vote? That's what it felt like my life had been reassigned. One morning I decided I wouldn't ask permission. I'd just see my house, reassure myself that it was still there, still mine, so I told the front desk I had an appointment and walked out feeling strangely nervous, like a child sneaking out of school. The taxi ride felt unreal, my hands trembling as familiar streets appeared, my heart pounding when my house finally came into view, and for a brief moment, relief washed over me, sigh, until I reached the door. My key didn't work. I tried again, slower this time, then harder, my hands shaking, my breath catching, and that's when panic set in, the kind that makes your ears ring. I rang the bell, waited, rang again, but no one answered, and the silence on the other side of that door felt cruel. A neighbor peeked out, surprised to see me, and asked gently if I was visiting, ha ha ha, as if I hadn't lived there half my life, and I forced a smile, saying yes, just visiting. Standing there, locked out of my own home, I felt something inside me crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thin thread snapping. I went back to the care home that day feeling smaller than when I left, my questions growing darker, my thoughts heavier, because keys don't stop working by accident, locks don't change themselves. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding, that while I was learning to accept this new place, something permanent had happened without me, something that wasn't meant to be undone. I didn't cry then, I didn't shout, I just lay there listening to the sounds of the hallway, thinking about how easy it is to move someone out of the way when they trust you, and wondering what else had been decided while I was busy being patient, because if my door no longer opened for me, I had to ask myself, who did it open for now? Have you ever felt the ground shift under you, not because something new happened, but because you finally understood what had already been done? That's where my mind went after that locked door, after the neighbor's polite smile, after the word visiting echoed in my head like a joke I wasn't meant to laugh at. Ha ha ha. I kept replaying it all, the smooth voices, the papers, the delays, and suddenly every small moment lined up into a picture I didn't want to see. Back at the care home, people spoke to me the same way, cheerful, patient, calm, but now I heard something different underneath, a certainty that I wasn't just staying, I was staying out of the way. I started paying closer attention, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, listening to how people spoke about me when they thought I wasn't really listening, noticing how often my son's name came up in conversations that didn't include me. I remember sitting in the common room one afternoon, pretending to read while a staff member mentioned my son handling things efficiently. And I looked up, heart pounding, asking what she meant, and she quickly corrected herself, smiling too fast, saying nothing important, just logistics, and that word stuck with me, logistics, like I was a package, not a person. Sai, have you ever realized that people can sound caring while taking control at the same time? That's when the questions got louder in my head, questions I should have asked earlier but didn't because I trusted the answers would be kind. I asked again about my house, not aggressively, just honestly, and this time the response was different, less patient, more rehearsed, saying it was being taken care of and that I shouldn't worry about it, and something about the way she avoided my eyes told me worrying was exactly what I should be doing. I laughed softly, trying to keep things light, hahaha, saying I just wanted to make sure my things were safe, my photos, my letters, the small pieces of my life, and she assured me everything was handled, and that word again, handled, like my life was a task on a list. That night I couldn't sleep, my thoughts racing, my chest tight, and I started counting details, dates, moments, trying to remember exactly when I'd last been asked what I wanted, and I couldn't find it, not once, not clearly. I thought about the papers I signed, how quickly my son pointed to the lines, how I didn't read every word because I trusted him, because why wouldn't I? He was my son, and that realization hurt more than the locked door ever could. There's a special kind of pain in knowing your kindness made something easier for someone else to take. The next day I called my son again, this time with more urgency in my voice, asking him directly if anything had changed with the house, and he sighed, sounding tired, saying he was managing things so I didn't have to stress. And I remember gripping the phone tighter, asking what managing meant, and there was that pause again, longer this time, before he said, "Don't worry, Mom, it's better this way," and my heart sank because better for who was a question he didn't answer. After that call, something inside me shifted, not into anger, not yet, but into awareness, and awareness can be terrifying when you realize how little control you have. I started noticing how mail no longer came for me, how my address had changed on forms without discussion, how my name was treated like a formality, something to be included but not consulted. Have you ever felt like your existence was still acknowledged but your authority wasn't? That's what it felt like I was present but powerless. One afternoon, a staff member mentioned my son had stopped by earlier, and my stomach dropped because he hadn't told me, and when I asked what he'd come for, she said something vague about paperwork, and that word echoed again, paperwork, 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 like it was doing all the talking for him. I went back to my room and sat on the bed, hands trembling, thinking about all the times I'd taught him to be honest, to speak up, to do the right thing, and wondering where those lessons went. I didn't cry then, I didn't scream, I just sat there feeling oddly calm, because sometimes calm is what happens right before the truth hits. And the truth was starting to feel clear that this wasn't about my safety or comfort, it was about convenience, about control, about decisions being easier when one voice is missing from the room. Ha, it almost amazed me how smoothly it had all been done, no fights, no ultimatums, just gentle guidance right out of my own life. That's when I decided I needed answers, real ones, not softened or delayed, and I didn't know yet how I'd get them or who would finally tell me the truth, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening to my house wasn't accidental, and whatever had been forgotten, overlooked, or ignored, it was something big enough to change everything once it came into the light, and that thought stayed with me as I lay awake that night, staring into the dark, wondering who else knew what I didn't, and how long they thought they could keep it that way. Have you ever noticed how people speak differently when they believe the decision is already final? How confidence creeps into their voice not because they're right, but because they think you can't stop them anymore. That's how my son sounded the next time we spoke, not rushed, not gentle, but settled, like someone explaining a plan that no longer needed approval, and the moment I heard that tone, sigh, my stomach dropped. He visited the care home on a quiet afternoon, smiling too much, standing instead of sitting, talking while I listened, and he kept saying things like, "I've handled it and everything's under control now." And I remember watching his hands move as he spoke, confident, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this version of himself. I asked him directly, trying to keep my voice steady, asking what exactly he meant by handled, and he laughed lightly, as if I was worrying over nothing, telling me I didn't need to stress about the house anymore because it was all taken care of. Have you ever been told not to worry right when you realize you should be terrified? That was me, sitting there nodding while something important slipped further away with every word he spoke. I asked if I could see the house again soon, and his smile tightened just a little, barely noticeable, and he said it wouldn't be practical, that travel was tiring for me, that this place was better suited now, and when he said now, it sounded permanent, like a door quietly closing. I sighed and asked him why no one had talked to me about any of this, and he leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, saying he'd done what was best, that sometimes hard choices had to be made, and hearing my own child explain my life to me like a lesson felt surreal, almost funny in a sad way, all like I'd suddenly become the child in the room. He started using words I'd never heard him use before, words like assets and arrangements and future planning, and each word felt colder than the last, as if my memories had been turned into numbers. I asked him where my things were, my photos, my letters, my furniture, and he waved it off, saying they were safe, stored, organized, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my life was now something to be stored. He kept avoiding my eyes whenever I mentioned the house, glancing away, checking his watch, speaking faster, and that avoidance told me more than his words ever could. Have you ever known someone was hiding something just by how carefully they spoke around it? That's when it hit me that he wasn't just helping, he was speaking for me, making decisions in my name, wearing my silence like permission. I tried one last time, quietly asking if he'd sold the house, and there it was, that pause, that familiar, heavy pause, and then he said yes, but quickly added that it was necessary, that it would help pay for my care, that I wouldn't have to worry anymore, and hearing my home reduced to a solution made my throat tight. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just sat there absorbing the words, feeling strangely hollow, because some betrayals are so unexpected they don't hurt right away, they just leave you stunned. He talked about paperwork and timing and buyers, all without once asking how I felt about it, and that's when I realized he didn't see my silence as pain, he saw it as agreement. If this story feels close to home, if you've ever felt someone slowly take control while calling it help, you might understand why stories like this need to be told. And if you want to hear more moments like these, where quiet conversations change everything, you might want to stay with this channel because these stories aren't as rare as we think. As he stood to leave, he patted my shoulder gently, like you'd reassure a patient, and told me not to worry, that everything was settled now, and when he walked away, I sat there listening to his footsteps fade, feeling a mix of disbelief and clarity. The disbelief came from realizing how easily it had all been done, no shouting, no fights, just calm explanations that left no room for my voice, and the clarity came from something else, something small but sharp, a detail he hadn't explained properly, a detail he'd rushed past every time the house came up. I replayed his words over and over in my head, the way he spoke about ownership, about transfers, about timing, and I felt a strange calm settle in, because confidence can be dangerous when it's built on assumptions. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I stopped asking why he did it and started asking how, because how mattered more now, and somewhere in that how was a truth he believed I didn't understand. He thought he'd spoken for me, thought he'd closed every door quietly, thought my story was finished, but as I lay there listening to the hum of the building around me, one thought kept returning, steady and persistent. That people who rush to explain everything often miss the one thing that can't be explained away, and whatever that one thing was, it hadn't disappeared just because he said it had. It was still there, waiting, and soon, very soon, it was going to speak louder than either of us expected. Have you ever felt watched in a way that isn't threatening but thoughtful, like someone is quietly trying to understand you without saying why? That was the feeling that followed me everywhere after my son's visit, a strange awareness that certain eyes lingered on me longer than before, especially from the staff who usually treated everyone the same. At first, I thought I was imagining it, because once your trust cracks, you start questioning your own senses, but then little things began to pile up, things too specific to ignore. A nurse would double-check my name more carefully than necessary, another would ask me questions that felt oddly adult, like how long I'd lived in my house, whether I'd ever managed my own finances, whether I preferred paperwork in the morning or afternoon, and I'd answer politely, all wondering why any of that mattered here. One afternoon, I noticed the manager standing nearby while I spoke with another resident, listening without interrupting, nodding slightly, and when our eyes met, he smiled in a way that didn't feel professional, it felt curious. Have you ever realized someone knows more than they're saying? That's when I started to feel like I wasn't just a resident here, but a question. The way people spoke to me changed subtly, not kinder, not colder, just more careful, like words mattered more around me than they did before. I heard my son's name mentioned less often, and when it was, it came with pauses, glances, unfinished sentences, and that silence said more than conversation ever could. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself not to read into things, but the human mind isn't good at ignoring patterns, especially when those patterns feel intentional. I remember sitting in the dining room one morning, sipping tea, when the manager approached me and asked how I was settling in, a simple question, but the way he asked it, slow and attentive, made me sit up straighter. We talked briefly, casually, about the food, the weather, the routine, and then he asked something that caught me off guard, asking whether I felt I'd been given enough say in my move here, and my heart skipped, because no one had asked me that before. I laughed nervously, saying it all happened quickly, and he nodded, not surprised, just thoughtful, like that confirmed something. After that conversation, the feeling grew stronger that something was unfolding quietly around me, something that didn't require my effort, only my awareness. Have you ever been in a situation where you sense a shift before you understand it? That's exactly how it felt, like standing on still ground while the room rearranges itself behind your back. A few days later, the manager asked if I'd be willing to chat in his office sometime, not formally, just to clear up a few details, and I agreed, though my hands trembled slightly as I did, because details had already taken so much from me. When I sat across from him, he didn't start with forms or rules. He asked about my life, my work, my home, how long I'd lived there. And as I spoke, sigh, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, like my words mattered again. He listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just absorbing, and when I finished, he leaned back and said quietly that it sounded like I'd been very independent for a long time, and that sentence alone made my eyes sting. He didn't accuse my son, didn't criticize anyone, he simply said it was important for them to understand the full picture, and that phrase lingered with me long after I left his office. If this story feels close to your heart, if you've ever felt slowly spoken over until your own voice faded, you might want to stay here and subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes hearing someone else's experience gives you back your own words. After that meeting, the care home didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a waiting room, and waiting rooms are meant for transition, not endings. I noticed small changes, how staff asked before making decisions about my schedule, how they checked in with me instead of around me, how my room suddenly felt less assigned and more temporary. I didn't celebrate, I didn't get hopeful, not yet, because hope can hurt when it comes too early, but I felt something steadier take its place, awareness. One evening, as I walked past the manager's office, I saw my file open on his desk, papers spread out, and though I didn't read them, the sight alone made my pulse quicken, because files mean questions, and questions mean uncertainty for the people who thought everything was settled. That night, lying in bed, I let myself imagine, just for a moment, that maybe the story wasn't finished, that maybe someone else had noticed the imbalance, the silence, the missing voice. I didn't know what they'd found or what they were thinking, but I sensed that the calm confidence my son had carried was beginning to meet something solid, something slower and more careful than his assumptions. Ha ha ha, it almost made me smile, the idea that while he believed everything was neatly wrapped up, someone else was gently untying the knots. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought stayed with me, comforting and unsettling all at once, that when people think you're no longer paying attention, they forget to hide the truth properly, and somewhere between quiet questions and careful listening, the truth about my house, my voice, and my place in all of this was starting to surface, piece by piece, whether my son was ready for it or not. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous details are usually hidden inside the most boring things, the things everyone assumes don't matter, like forms, dates, signatures, and fine print? That's what my thoughts kept circling back to after my talk with the manager, because once someone finally listens to you, you start replaying everything you once ignored. I began thinking about those papers I signed on the day I arrived, how quickly my son slid them across the table, how he pointed to the lines without explaining, how I signed because it felt easier than questioning him, sigh, and suddenly that moment felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. I asked the manager if I could see my file, not urgently, not accusingly, just curious, and he didn't hesitate, which surprised me, because hesitation usually means there's something to hide. He laid the papers out slowly, one by one, explaining them in plain words, not legal language, and as he spoke, my chest tightened, because the story those papers told wasn't the one I'd been given. Dates stood out first, dates that didn't match what my son had said, timelines that suggested decisions were made long before I was ever told there was a problem. I laughed softly, ha ha ha, more out of shock than humor, asking if this was normal, and the manager didn't answer right away. He just said sometimes people assume consent when they're in a hurry. Have you ever realized someone used your silence as permission? That thought sat heavy in my stomach as we went through the pages, because silence had always been my way of keeping peace, and now it looked like peace had cost me everything. I noticed one document in particular, one that referenced authority, decision-making power, and long-term arrangements, and I asked what it meant, my voice quieter than I expected. The manager explained it carefully, saying it outlined who could make choices on my behalf, under what conditions, and for how long, and as he spoke, I felt a strange mix of fear and clarity, because nowhere in those conditions did it say I had stopped being capable. All that realization stung because it meant I hadn't been replaced due to weakness but convenience. I asked if the house sale was connected to these papers, and for the first time, I saw the manager hesitate, not out of guilt but out of concern, like he was choosing his words with care. He said the sale was presented as necessary, but necessity depends on perspective, and perspective changes when all voices are present. That sentence stayed with me because my voice hadn't been present at all. As we continued, I saw references to my house described in terms that felt foreign: asset, property, proceeds, words that stripped away memory and warmth, and I felt a tightness in my throat thinking about my kitchen, my chair, my plants, reduced to numbers on a page. I shook my head slowly, sigh, wondering how easily a life can be converted into paperwork when the owner isn't in the room. The manager pointed out something subtle then, something my son must have assumed I wouldn't understand, a condition tied to ownership and authority that hadn't been properly met, a detail so small it could be missed if you weren't looking for it. I didn't grasp it fully at first, but I understood enough to know it mattered, that this wasn't as simple as my son had made it sound. Have you ever felt the ground steady beneath you not because you're winning, but because the truth finally has structure? That's what it felt like, not victory, not relief, but alignment, like things were starting to make sense in a way they hadn't before. The manager told me they were obligated to review situations where a resident's independence might have been underestimated, and hearing the word underestimated made my eyes sting, because I'd been underestimated my whole life, but never by my own child. We talked for a long time, not rushing, going over what could and couldn't be done, what questions needed answers, and I realized something important in that room, that no one was fighting for me, but they were finally making space for me to speak. I left the office with my head buzzing, not from confusion but from possibility, and that scared me almost as much as the betrayal had, because hope is heavy when you're not sure where it will land. That night lying in bed, I replayed every detail, every pause my son took when I asked about the house, every confident explanation he gave, and I saw them differently now, not as certainty but as assumption. Ha, it almost made me sad, realizing how sure he'd been of something he hadn't fully checked. I thought about the care home, how it had shifted from a place I was placed into, to a place that was now questioning why I was there, and that shift felt powerful in a quiet way. I didn't know what would happen next, I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing for certain: the story my son believed was finished had loose ends, and those loose ends were tied to details he thought were too small to matter. As I drifted off to sleep, listening to the soft sounds of the hallway, I felt calmer than I had in weeks, because when the truth is written down, even in boring ink on dull paper, it has a way of standing up for you when your voice has been ignored, and whatever came next, whatever conversations were about to happen, they wouldn't be based on assumptions anymore. They'd be based on what was actually there, waiting patiently to be read. Have you ever felt a shift in the air before anyone says a word, like the room itself knows something is about to change? That's how it felt in the days that followed, not loud, not dramatic, just different, sigh, as if the ground beneath me had stopped sliding and finally decided where it stood. I noticed it in the smallest ways, the way staff waited for my answers instead of moving on without them, the way questions were asked instead of assumptions made, and it was strange how quickly respect returns once people realize you're still present. I didn't announce anything, I didn't confront anyone yet, I simply observed, and observation can be powerful when others believe the story is already over. One morning, the manager asked me to join him for a brief conversation, and the tone of his voice wasn't urgent or apologetic. It was steady, deliberate, like someone who had confirmed what they needed to confirm. As we talked, he explained that certain steps were being reviewed, not reversed yet, just reviewed, and while that might sound small, it felt enormous to me, because review means doubt, and doubt cracks certainty wide open. Have you ever watched confidence fade without a fight, just because facts quietly took their place? That's what I imagined happening somewhere else, maybe in my son's mind, though he didn't know it yet. The manager told me they had reached out for clarification, routine clarification he called it, but his eyes told me it was more than routine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like the truth wasn't chasing anyone anymore, it was waiting calmly to be acknowledged. I walked back to my room that day with a strange lightness, not happiness, not triumph, just balance, the kind that comes when things stop being stacked unfairly. People often think power looks loud, like arguments or authority, but real power is quiet. It's knowing you don't have to convince anyone because the facts will speak when the time comes. Sitting by the window later, watching the afternoon sun move slowly across the floor, I thought about how rushed everything had been before, how quickly decisions were made, how little time was spent asking questions, and now suddenly time had slowed down, as if someone had finally pressed pause. If this moment feels meaningful to you, if you've ever waited quietly while the truth caught up, you might want to subscribe and stay here for more stories like this, because not every turning point comes with noise, some arrive softly and change everything anyway. Later that day, I overheard a conversation in the hallway, nothing dramatic, just voices lowered slightly, words like confirmation and verification passing through the air, and my heart beat faster, not from fear but from recognition. They were checking, really checking, and once people start checking, assumptions don't survive very long. I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate, I just sat there breathing steadily because I knew something my son didn't, that the confidence he'd carried into every conversation was built on speed, not certainty. Speed creates mistakes, especially when it comes to things you think someone else won't question. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt calm enough to laugh softly, not out of joy, but out of disbelief at how quietly the balance was shifting. No one had accused him, no one had confronted him yet, but the structure he believed was solid was being examined piece by piece, and examination has a way of exposing cracks. I thought about how he'd spoken so confidently about being done, about everything being settled, and I realized that people who rush to settle things often do so because they're afraid of what happens if time slows down. Time had slowed down now. The care home felt different too, less like a place I was placed and more like a place that was reassessing its own role in my story, and that mattered because when institutions pause, outcomes change. I didn't know when my son would find out or how he would react, but I knew the next time he walked in with that familiar confidence, he wouldn't be walking into silence anymore. As sleep finally came, one thought stayed with me, steady and clear, that when the truth stops running, it doesn't need to chase anyone, it just waits, and soon enough, everyone else has to catch up to it. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room carrying confidence, so thick it almost feels heavy, only to realize they have no idea the ground beneath them has already shifted? That was the feeling when my son came back, his steps familiar, his posture relaxed, his voice steady in that way people sound when they believe everything is settled. He greeted me like before, casual, almost cheerful, as if we were resuming a conversation he'd already finished in his head, and I listened quietly, noticing how little he asked and how much he explained. He spoke about arrangements, about how things were going smoothly now, about how I didn't need to worry anymore, and as he talked, I realized something strange, that he wasn't checking for agreement, he was confirming his own story out loud. Have you ever seen someone talk themselves into believing nothing can go wrong? That was him, smiling slightly, relaxed, certain. I nodded occasionally, not because I agreed, but because silence can be powerful when someone else is doing all the talking. He mentioned the house briefly, just in passing, like a detail already resolved, and he used words like handled and finalized, and hearing them now didn't hurt the way they once did because they sounded less like truth and more like habit. Ha ha ha, it almost felt like watching a play where the actor didn't realize the script had changed. The manager passed by at one point, greeting us politely, and my son barely noticed, continuing his explanation without pause, unaware that the calm authority he carried wasn't being mirrored anymore. I watched his face closely, the small expressions, the ease with which he spoke, and I realized he truly believed the hardest part was over. Have you ever been so sure of yourself that you stop listening? That's when mistakes stop hiding. The conversation drifted, my son filling the space with plans and reassurances, and I asked one simple question, not confrontational, not emotional, just curious, asking how everything had been confirmed so quickly. He answered without hesitation, citing documents and signatures, and that's when I noticed it, the way he skipped over specifics, the way he generalized details as if precision might slow him down. I didn't correct him, I didn't challenge him, I just nodded again, off feeling oddly calm because confidence built on assumptions has a fragile center. At one point he laughed lightly, saying it was all behind us now, and I almost laughed too, because behind us felt like a dangerous phrase, one people use when they don't plan on looking back. The manager returned later, standing nearby, listening without interrupting, and the room felt suddenly tighter, like two versions of the same story were about to overlap. My son kept talking unaware, and I noticed how his voice grew slightly louder, not aggressive, just firm, the way people sound when they're trying to reinforce certainty. Have you ever seen certainty start to wobble without the person realizing why? That's what it looked like, small pauses creeping into his sentences, tiny hesitations when he noticed the manager listening a little too closely. I could see it in his eyes then, the first flicker of discomfort, not fear yet, just confusion, like a math problem that suddenly doesn't add up. He glanced at me, searching for reassurance, and I met his gaze calmly, offering nothing, and that silence seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. The conversation ended politely, no accusations, no raised voices, just a few unanswered questions hanging in the air, and as he stood to leave, his confidence didn't follow him out the door the way it usually did. I watched him walk away feeling something unexpected, not satisfaction, not anger, but a quiet sense of inevitability. That night, lying in bed, I replayed his words, the way he spoke as if speed had secured everything, and I thought about how quickly he'd moved, how little time he'd left for anyone else to ask questions. Speed can feel like strength until someone slows things down. Ha ha ha, it almost made me feel sorry for him, realizing he'd mistaken silence for agreement and calm for completion. The care home felt unusually quiet that evening, like everyone was waiting for the same thing without saying it out loud, and I understood then that nothing dramatic had to happen for everything to change. No confrontation, no demand, just facts lining up quietly in the background, doing their work. I drifted toward sleep feeling steadier than I had in a long time, because once someone believes they've already won, they stop guarding their blind spots, and whatever came next wouldn't need force or noise, it would only need to arrive at the right moment, when confidence has nowhere left to hide. Have you ever heard a sentence so simple that it changes the way everyone in the room breathes? That's what happened that day, though it didn't arrive with drama or raised voices, just a pause, a small one, the kind people don't notice unless they're paying attention. My son had come in again, still trying to hold on to that familiar confidence, but it was thinner now, stretched like a smile worn too long. He spoke less this time, choosing his words carefully, and I could feel something tightening in him, a sense that the ground wasn't as solid as he remembered. The manager stood nearby, calm, composed, holding a folder loosely in his hands, and there was something about the way he waited that made the room feel quiet in a different way, not awkward, just expectant. Have you ever felt time slow down right before the truth steps forward? That's how it felt, sigh like the air itself was listening. The manager finally spoke, addressing my son politely, professionally, asking a few clarifying questions, simple ones about timelines, confirmations, and authority, and my son answered quickly at first, then slower, then with small pauses slipping into his sentences. I watched his face change almost imperceptibly, the way certainty drains not all at once, but in stages, disbelief first, then confusion, then something closer to fear. Ha ha ha, it was strange to witness, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of sadness, because I recognized that look. It's the look of someone realizing they might not have understood everything as well as they thought. The manager nodded as my son spoke, then opened the folder and pointed to a page, explaining quietly that there was one condition that hadn't been met, one detail that mattered more than the rest. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, he simply stated it as fact, and facts have a way of sounding louder than anger ever could. My son tried to respond, his words stumbling slightly, his confidence scrambling to catch up, but the more he spoke, the more it became clear he was reacting, not explaining. I sat there listening, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beating steadily, awe-surprised by how calm I felt, because this moment wasn't about winning, it was about truth finally standing where it belonged. Then the manager turned toward me, his expression respectful, almost gentle, and said the words that seemed to tilt the entire room, "Welcome back, owner." There was no emphasis, no drama, just clarity, and for a second no one spoke. My son's face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly as if to argue, then closing again when he realized there was nothing left to say. Have you ever seen someone lose control without anyone taking it from them? That's what it looked like the story he'd been telling himself collapsed under its own weight. I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, I just breathed, feeling something settle inside me, not triumph but restoration. The manager explained calmly what that meant, what would happen next, what steps would be taken, and my son listened in silence, nodding stiffly, his eyes fixed somewhere past the room. I could see the realization hitting him in waves, that speed hadn't protected him, that assumptions had betrayed him, that the one thing he hadn't fully checked had undone everything. Sigh, I almost wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but then I remembered how easily he'd spoken for me, how quickly he'd decided my life without asking, and I stayed still. When the conversation ended, my son stood there awkwardly, searching for words, then finally said my name softly, not as an explanation, not as a defense, but as a question, and I met his gaze calmly, because calm can be more powerful than anger. He left shortly after, his steps slower this time, and as the door closed behind him, the room felt lighter, not because something had ended, but because something had been returned. That evening, lying in bed, I replayed the moment again and again, not the words themselves, but the silence that followed them, the silence where truth finally had space to exist. Ha, it amazed me how one overlooked detail could undo so much certainty, how something so quiet could shift everything. And as I drifted toward sleep, one thought stayed with me, steady and clear, that when someone builds their confidence on rushing past you, all it takes is one moment of stillness for everything to fall back into its rightful place. Have you ever won something back and realized the victory didn't feel the way you imagined it would? That was the feeling that stayed with me after everything settled, not joy, not celebration, just a quiet stillness, like a deep breath after holding it for too long. People congratulated me gently, spoke in careful tones, as if they expected me to smile or cry or react somehow, but I didn't, I just listened, nodding slowly, sigh, because what I'd lost and found again wasn't just a house, it was my place in my own life. The process of returning things to their rightful order moved calmly, deliberately, without drama, and I watched it happen with a strange sense of distance, as if I were observing my own story from the outside. I was asked questions again, real ones this time, about what I wanted, how I wanted things handled, where I wanted to be, and each question felt like a small repair, a stitch closing something that had been torn. Have you ever realized how powerful being asked can feel after a long time of being told? That's what surprised me most, not the outcome, but the respect that returned with it. My son and I spoke again, briefly, carefully, and there were no excuses that mattered anymore, just an understanding hanging between us that something important had been broken and couldn't be fixed by explanations alone. He apologized quietly, and I accepted the apology without embracing it, because forgiveness doesn't always mean closeness, sometimes it just means letting go of anger so it doesn't weigh you down. Hahaha, I learned then that boundaries can exist even in love, and that learning stayed with me longer than any paperwork ever could. The house was still there, waiting, familiar yet changed by absence, and walking through it again felt like meeting an old friend after a long misunderstanding. I touched the walls, the furniture, the small corners of memory, and instead of relief, I felt gratitude, not because it was returned to me, but because I'd been returned to myself. I chose not to move back right away, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because choice means more when it's truly yours. People often assume taking something back means going back to how things were, but sometimes it means moving forward differently. If this story has stayed with you, if you felt seen or understood in these moments, I invite you to subscribe and stay with this channel, because there are many quiet stories like this, stories about dignity, patience, and finding your voice again, and they deserve to be told. I spent more time at the care home for a while, but on my own terms, coming and going as I pleased, and that freedom, more than the house itself, felt like the real victory. I noticed how differently I carried myself then, straighter, calmer, not because I'd won something, but because I'd remembered who I was. My son learned something too, though he didn't say it out loud, that love doesn't grant ownership and concern doesn't excuse control, and watching that realization settle into him was enough for me. As weeks passed, life found a new rhythm, quieter, steadier, built on conversations instead of assumptions, and I found peace in that balance. There was no grand ending, no dramatic final moment, just a gentle understanding that my story hadn't ended when others decided it should. Hahaha, sometimes the most satisfying endings are the ones that don't shout, the ones that simply exist. As I look back now, what stays with me isn't anger or resentment, but a calm certainty that my voice matters, even when it trembles, even when it's ignored at first. And if you take anything from this story, let it be this: that patience is powerful, but only when it's paired with awareness, and silence can protect you, but it should never erase you. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and if you'd like to hear more real moments like this, moments that unfold quietly but change everything, I hope you'll stay, because sometimes all it takes to reclaim your life is the courage to listen to that small voice inside you, the one that knows, even when no one else seems to, that you still belong.